If you talk about an adaptation of a book, you're likely going to get comments like, the book was better. And look, that's usually the case, especially when it comes to movies. That is not to say there aren't obvious exceptions like Jaws or Shawshank Redemption. Some people would argue the same for like The Princess Bride and Fight Club, among others. Still, in the higher percentage of cases, books are king. But what about when the book is made into a show? You don't have the same time restrictions of a movie in this case. There's more space to develop characters, to expand upon storyline threads and backstories that may have only been briefly mentioned in the book. It's just a better medium for adapting books because it has several advantages over movies. So today we're going to talk about cases where I thought the show was better than the book. And while you're here, if you're into the content, you know all the usual calls to action, like, sub, ring the bell, check out my link tree, and see if any of my other efforts like my Sickos Bindery community are up your alley. Or maybe you need some handmade bookmarks from my wife's Etsy shop. But mainly I want to know in the comments if you agree or disagree with this list here, and if you have any other show book combos to add to the discussion. Now let's pitter patter, get at her. Let's start by saying I think the show Station 11 is better than the book Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, despite the book being pretty good. The quick and dirty premise for both is there's a swine flu pandemic that has decimated the world's population. 20 years after the initial devastation, we follow a nomadic band of actors and musicians called the Traveling Symphony who cycle through the small surviving settlements in the Great Lakes region. And they're performing Shakespeare plays for these people. In their travels, they encounter a violent prophet, and we go from there. There are several key choices the show made to expand upon the book that worked brilliantly, including a character named Jevin. I forget exactly how it's pronounced, but still, he has a bigger presence in the story, and it adds to the element of mystery as we learn how our main character, Kristen, and him part ways, despite being so connected at the very beginning of the story. This is like the new heart of the story for the show, and it's so damn good. Plus the actor, Himesh Patel, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was tremendous in that role. And I mentioned a prophet at the top too. His whole storyline is altered for the show, and for my money, it's executed better there too. And the endings are so different from each other. The ending of the show felt more connected, and the payoff was unbelievable. I mean, I'm not ashamed to say that I got a little misty. I think it is a masterpiece. So while I still recommend the book, I would also recommend watching the show after. They're two very different experiences that work for their mediums. And like I said, they are both bangers. Now let's talk about The Handmaid's Tale. This is by Margaret Atwood, and I recently talked about the book and the show a bit in my December reading wrap-up, so check that out if you want more of my thoughts. So I'll get right to it here. I do think if we're talking about realism, the effect of fear and paranoia is better represented in the book, but the show having Offred as less passive works better in that medium. So it's a bit of a coin flip for me in that regard, and probably depends on what resonates with you as a reader or a viewer. Overall, one of my issues with the book was we were only looking at the world through Offred's keyhole perspective, which worked in a way at the sacrifice of the overall world building, which has a fascinating concept involving the Republic of Gilead defeating the United States and imprisoning selected women as handmaids to offset the rapidly declining birth rate. The world at large in this setting just works better in the show. Essentially, it takes the historical notes from the end of the book, along with other hints and clues and whatnot, to fully flesh out this world, and it is utterly compelling and horrifying. We also get expanded storylines and backstories for other tertiary characters that are complicated and devastating. So yeah, in that way, I give a nod to the show. And this isn't meant to be a slight at the book. I think the show, especially the first 2 seasons, is top-notch stuff, and it's just hard to contend with. Next up, we've got The Man in the High Castle. This old-school science fiction, and look, old-school science fiction just hasn't really clicked for me for a number of reasons, so maybe it's me. But in this case, I think it's you, babe. I mean, this book actually turned me off of sci-fi cold turkey for a while. I did not have a good time with it. Now, the concept of it, the idea of the what-if scenario where the Axis won World War II and America is occupied by Germany and Japan, that is such a strong sell for me. The execution of the book, brother, there's not enough LSD on the planet that could get me to enjoy this, probably because the author took it all while writing this. I am a very character-driven reader, and I think that's where some of the disconnect with old-school sci-fi comes in for me, along with that aforementioned issue. The characters in the book are written poorly. They're just not interesting. They're plastic bananas. There's nothing to them. Plastic bananas? Wax bananas? Plastic bananas works. The antique seller might be the only exception to this, and he's still pretty forgettable. The best things about the book is the initial concept, and that's it. The show did a tremendous job taking what was interesting about the book and expanding out on that without getting hyper fixated on the wrong and weird things like the book did. And for that reason, I prefer the show, The Man in the High Castle. This one might be controversial. Foundation by Isaac Asimov. However, overall, I do give a nod to the book for its overall messaging, which I feel the show failed to capture or even understand at points. And I do think that this is a tough call. And I mean, at the heart of it, the book only serves as a skeleton for the show. It's a loose framework. They are two very different things. So that makes the comparison even more difficult. Okay, so what is Foundation about, if you don't know? Foundation is about the decaying galactic empire. You're pulling inspiration from the fall of Rome here, essentially. And you've got a mathematician who's developing a theory of psychohistory to predict the future. He sees the fall of the galactic empire coming, and while he can't stop it, he has a plan to limit the coming Dark Age substantially. And putting that plan in motion, the events that come from that, that's your basic framework for the plot here. This is both for the book and for the show. Now, there are several tweaks and full-blown adjustments the show made, like the Starbridge incident, for example. But if I'm looking at both and saying beyond the core premise, what's the most interesting aspect? This is where I have to give a firm nod to the show, because for me, it's the idea of the galactic emperors being clones, which is not in the book. You've got Brother Dawn, Brother Day, and Brother Dusk. They are genetic clones of the great Emperor Cleon at 3 stages of his life: young, middle-aged, and old. It's a genetic dynasty that allows for continuity in this role while dealing with time jumps in the show, and it's a fascinating concept that honestly saved the show for me. Now, the book is fine. The show is okay. Both have strengths and weaknesses, but solely on the strength of the cloned emperors. And again, this might be controversial, I give the nod to the show. These next two are so obvious and clear cut, and they're so well known that I don't think I have to explain them in great detail. So let's just put the fries in the bag. Let's start with Dexter. The show isn't perfect by any means. For example, despite laying solid groundwork for the rest of the run and having an interesting villain, the first season does not age well overall on rewatch. The season 6 storyline should have been the final death knell, if you know, you know. And the series finale, hell, the entirety of season 8 was just a wet fart. But ultimately, the show did have some quality moments, like season 2 capitalized on everything that the first season laid out. Season 4 with Trinity was a banger. There's enough there to hang your hat on to stick it out for a while. Basically, the show took the general concepts from the book and made it better, while also removing the silly supernatural elements of the Dark Passenger and just creating a better supporting cast of characters. The general ideas of the book are mostly solid. The execution is poor. It's too simplistic, it's too predictable, it's too boring. Unless you're a diehard fan that just has to know, avoid the books. And finally, the True Blood show was adapted from Charlaine Harris's Sookie Stackhouse novels, also known as the Southern Vampire Mysteries, if I'm not mistaken, starting with the first book, Dead Until Dark. Back in my bookstore manager days, these books were flying off the shelves, and being a slave to FOMO, I decided to check them out. And I'm sorry if you love these. You may want to skip this next part. This book flat out sucked. Yeah, sure, reading is subjective. All the usual disclaimers. It sucked. The plot is preteen elementary school baby town frolics. It's so campy. The characters are horrendously flat stereotypes. None of the characters can articulate why they love Sookie, but they do, because she's the main character, I guess. Who effing knows? And either be young adult or don't. Make up your mind. And look, maybe the books get better. God help you if you read all 13 and they didn't, but I am never going to find out for myself. And even though I wasn't the biggest fan of the show, it was good enough to give it the clear nod here. That was a really sour note to end on. I apologize about that, but some things can't be helped. Anyway, I hope I helped you find some new books or shows to watch and helped you avoid some other less desirable books. As always, thank you for hanging out with me for these. This channel has been just seeing tremendous growth in the early days of its formation here. And that's thanks to the support from you. I will see you on the next one. I appreciate y'all.